Today we're going to do the last video in my series on composite discourses in Matthew and whether there are composite discourses in Matthew. This series has been a little less popular than some others on YouTube, maybe because it's so dusty, and kind of specialized, but I think it's important material. This will be the last video, and if you want additional information, there is additional information on this if you want to do an even deeper dive, or if you just want it in written form in an appendix to The Mirror or the Mask, my book, The Mirror or the Mask. I have a whole appendix on Matthean Discourses. So you may remember that the question that I'm trying to address in this series is whether Matthew dischronologically created composite discourses. Did Matthew draw sayings from other places in Jesus' ministry and then deliberately write as though, trying to make it look as though he said all of those on a particular occasion, even though Matthew knew that he didn't say all of those on a particular occasion? And I'm stressing this very explicitly, this dischronological aspect. I think there are genuinely conservative commentators who are open to the idea of composite discourses, but they haven't really thought through the achronological, dischronological distinction. You'll remember that achronological narration arises when the author is not trying to give the impression that this all happened at a given time. He's not trying to make it look that way. In the story world of his story, he's just being unclear about when something happened or how long something took. Whereas dischronological narration is actually changing the time when something happened or the amount of time that it took or something like that. Now, both Dr. Michael Licona and Craig Evans, conservative labeled scholars, have used this idea of Matthean composite discourses as kind of a wedge issue to say, if you don't believe this or if you don't accept this, you just are so out of touch with scholarship. And I discussed in an earlier video, I'm not going to recap now, how Dr. Evans actually used the allegedly unquestionable fact of Matthean composite discourses as an argument against John's robust historicity. Watch a different video earlier, I think the very first one in the series, where I explain how that happens. And then Dr. Licona has used this allegedly, beyond question fact as an argument that the authors did engage in dischronological narration. I've been using D.A. Carson, who does not think that Matthew creates these kinds of dischronological composite discourses, to show you that this is not just me. There are learned scholars who don't think that Matthew did that. And Carson is particularly talking about bracketed discourses where Matthew has, Jesus said these things, and then at the other end he has a little bracket, and when he had finished saying all these things, which in itself appears to be saying that what's in between those brackets was said in a at least recognizable form, some recognizable form, on a single occasion. Among the sayings that are found both in Matthew and in other Gospels, I've talked about three categories, and I'm going to talk about the fourth category today, of sayings that are used to argue that Matthew did this kind of dischronological composite discourse, which I don't think are good arguments for that. So I'm going to go over those four categories now. At the end of the video today, I'm going to go over them again, and I'll add a fifth category that I'm not going into in detail in this series, but I do talk about in that appendix to The Mirror of the Mask. First category, sayings that are found in Matthean Discourses and found only achronologically elsewhere, usually in Luke. So there's not really even an apparent conflict between their placements. Luke has a lot of achronological material. This is why I don't advise that you go out there and say, Luke said that he was recording everything in order. That's in the early introduction to Luke, and that means in chronological order. I don't think he could have meant chronological order. So in order presumably means something different there in his little introduction to Theophilus, because in many places it's very obvious that Luke is just being achronological. When the crowds were increasing, he said, and he said to his disciples, no setting at all. Okay, so then to say that just because it comes in this largely achronological central section of Luke, that's a different later setting from, say, the Sermon on the Mount, which is fairly early in Jesus' ministry, it's misleading and misguided. All right, second category, sayings that are found in both the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Level Place in Luke. Now, these are, I argued, probably the same event. So if they're the same event and sayings that are recognizably very similar are found in both of them, that's not even an apparent conflict. And I discussed the no, it can't be, because one was on a level place and one was on the mountain. I discussed that in the earlier video. Third category, sayings that are found twice in Matthew itself or twice in some other gospel, like twice in John, twice in Mark, or twice in Luke, okay? Thus showing in an independent way that Jesus was fond of repeating that saying. So if they're found in Matthew, if that saying is found in Matthew and then in some other gospel, but we have this independent evidence that Jesus was very fond of that saying, that was a saying he said more than once, then why doubt that he taught it more than once? And so the argument there is that when it actually occurs twice in different settings within the very same gospel, the author is presenting this as a saying that Jesus taught twice, okay? And that's important, and it's important not to use those sayings where we already know that Jesus taught it twice, that specific saying, to argue for a composite discourse in Matthew. Now today, last category I'm going to be talking about, these are sayings that are found only once in Matthew and only once in another gospel in fairly clearly different settings. Okay, so we're coming to a place where, yes, there are sayings that are in a discourse in Matthew and then in a different place with an apparently different setting. And I believe all the ones I'm going to do today are in Luke. But once we've got our common sense engaged, we have ample evidence that Jesus in general did repeat teachings. We know that both from the common experience of teachers and presenters, and from the previous category where we actually see Jesus teaching the same thing twice in a given gospel. So these are cases where he doesn't teach the same thing twice in one gospel, and yet we know that he did repeat. So it's not some kind of desperate religious fundamentalist harmonization to say, that looks like a different setting. He probably did teach it twice. This should be no problem for us. But once we have those other categories in place, that actually also reduces the number where this would be our best explanation anyway. Okay, I hope you follow that. So I'm going to give you 3 examples where, yes, it's once in a discourse in Matthew and once in a different setting in a different gospel. And I'm just going to say, Jesus probably taught it twice. Not something to get head up about. Very plausible. All right. First one is from Luke 12, 58 and 59, similar to Matthew 5, 25 and 26. I'm not going to read this aloud, but it's very similar wording. You can look it up. It's telling you to agree quickly with your opponent at law, that if you and your opponent, you've got somebody and, you're arguing about something and you've actually gone to the courts over it to try to get a judgment, you should try to settle out of court. Now, I'm sure this is metaphorical in Jesus' case, to at least some extent cover a wider class of such situations, but I'm not going to get into that. The point is, in Matthew 12, 58 to 59, this agree with your opponent quickly while you are in the way, is very similar to Matthew 5, 25 and 26. Now, Matthew 5 is, of course, part of the Sermon on the Mount. So the saying is found in the Sermon on the Mount. All right. It does appear to be a different setting. To some extent, this is conjecture, but I would say yes. It does appear not to be in the Sermon on the Mount in Luke. It's not in the Sermon on the Level Place in Luke, and it's not just a chronological in Luke. And the reason for my saying this is that in Luke, so those are the last two verses of Luke 12. And then Luke 13:1 says, on that same occasion, he's very explicit, and Jesus is teaching the crowds, and someone asks Jesus about those whose blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices. So they kind of call out a question. And then Jesus goes into a set of teachings on the need for repentance. Unless you repent, you will perish, okay? Now, I suppose that whole thing, including people calling out a question, could have occurred in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. He's there for quite a while. But there's no really good place to put this exchange and teaching on repentance in the Sermon on the Mount. So it's not knocked down, but plausibly these are different times. And I'm just going to say, okay, Jesus taught people twice this thing about agree with your opponent quickly so that you don't get dragged before the judge. You will not get out of there until you have paid the last cent. So it's a kind of an ominous saying, ominous phrase. I think Jesus just repeated his material. No biggie. The next one is the longest passage from the Sermon on the Mount that appears to be taught in a different context in Luke, and that is the Lord's Prayer. Now, I'm not going to read the Lord's Prayer from Luke and from Matthew. I'll just say that in Luke it's shorter. It doesn't contain, which art in heaven, it's just our Father. It doesn't contain deliver us from evil. It contains lead us not into temptation, but doesn't include deliver us from evil, and doesn't include thine is the kingdom. So this occurs in Matthew 6, 9 through 13, again, part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus teaching how to pray and giving this prayer. In Luke 11, it does appear to be a different setting, and I would say pretty strongly appears. Jesus has been praying. The disciples find Jesus praying, and they say to him, one of them says to him, teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples. Okay. And the disciples speak to him after he's finished praying. And then he gives this teaching. He also goes on in Luke 11 with further teachings on prayer, such as the parable about going to your friend's house and getting him out of bed to give you bread because you have a guest, and so on. And that's only in Luke. And it's sort of teaching you to bug God, as it were, to not give up, keep praying for something. All right. Now, here's what I say about this in the Mirror of the Mask. I thought I said this pretty well. Prayer was extremely important to Jesus, and on one occasion he even tacitly chided his disciples for being unable to cast out an evil spirit that could be cast out only by much prayer. We don't know exactly what the disciple was expecting in the way of instruction when he made the request in Luke 11:1. What parallels was he expecting to the instruction that John the Baptist gave to his own disciples? So I haven't mentioned that yet in this video. He says, teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples. So apparently Jesus' disciples knew that John the Baptist had had some teachings about prayer to his disciples, and they're like, hey, we'd like you to give us similar teachings about prayer. Well, what was that supposed to be like? Were all those present in Luke 11 also present at the Sermon on the Mount? Good question. All right, so we don't know that this was just the 12. Disciples can cover larger groups. We have the 70, for example. And I believe that Matthew, for example, was called a little bit later in Jesus' ministry. So we don't know that everybody who was standing there when this disciple made this request, was he actually even present at the Sermon on the Mount? Moreover, if he told it as part of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, to a larger crowd, this would be a case where he would be emphasizing it more in a smaller, more intimate group. It would be overreading in the extreme, I said, to argue that Luke is implying by the disciples' request that Jesus had never taught the Lord's Prayer on any previous occasion. Indeed, it is antecedently probable both that Jesus taught about prayer on many occasions throughout his ministry, and that a disciple making such a request was hoping for more detailed private instruction than merely a reiteration of the Lord's Prayer. So even if that disciple had heard that, he may be hoping for more. So years ago, I actually had an online debate with a friend. He's a good friend, but who, for whatever reason, was just insistent that Jesus would not have taught the Lord's Prayer twice, even part of the Lord's Prayer twice, and that if they're coming and saying, teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples, that has to mean that that he hadn't taught them the Lord's Prayer before. And I just do not think that that's justified at all the less so since there's more wording, there's more stuff in the version in Matthew. I'm going to read D.A. Carson on this. Unless one is prepared to say that one or the other is made up, the reasonable explanation is that Jesus taught this sort of prayer often during his itinerant ministry, and that Matthew records one occasion and Luke the other. Yay! The evidence for two separate traditions for the Lord's Prayer is so strong that the simplest comprehensive explanation is that Jesus himself taught this form of prayer on more than one occasion. So Carson's he's putting it out there, and I think he's right. You know, if this video series has done anything for me personally, it's to even increase my confidence that Jesus taught things repeatedly beyond what it was before, especially that little review I did for the previous video about places where Jesus is teaching something that looks exactly the same, like sometimes 3 or 4 different contexts in the Gospels. 2 of them maybe in John, and one in Matthew, one in Luke, something like that. And I'm like, wow, we really have evidence that he was not averse to repeating himself. Okay. All right. Last example I'm going to give of cases where I just think there's not even much of a bullet to bite, but if you want to put it like this, we should bite the bullet and just say, yeah, Jesus taught that more than once. Luke 14:26 and Matthew 10:37. So the Matthew verse here is from what's called the commissioning discourse, when Jesus is going to send out the 12 on their own in pairs without him to go preach in the cities. All right. In Luke 14:26, we have, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So notice this. There's a theme there about losing your own life, hating your own life, which we've already seen is a big theme for Jesus. All right. Matthew 10:37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Okay, now Luke, in his setting, says that Jesus said this to large crowds. Luke 14:26. We don't know necessarily exactly when in his ministry he was talking to these particular large crowds, but he definitely says that he said it to the large crowds. Matthew says that he taught it specifically to his disciples before sending them out as part of the commissioning discourse. So, that makes for a plausible situation where these are 2 different settings, one of them being addressed to a much larger audience, the other being addressed very specifically to a smaller audience. I think it's possible. I mean, large crowds followed Jesus all the time. And so I think there were occasions where there was a large crowd out there and Jesus kind of drew his disciples away. Remember, he doesn't have a microphone attached to his, ear coming over here that's turned on that's going to pick up everything he says. So all he has to do is kind of say, hey guys, come here, and he can give instruction to them privately, even if there are crowds around. So I think it's plausible that these are different settings. But it's very plausible that Jesus said these similar things on multiple occasions. Matthew's is worded a little more gently. You're not supposed to love your family more than him. Luke's is worded in that kind of strong hyperbolic way that you should hate your family. I was moved to think about this recently when I was thinking about people who have family members whom they love, who are living in sinful relationships and sinful, according to what Jesus taught. And it's really hard. If you convert to Christianity, of course, if you're a Muslim, your family may disown you. If you're a Hindu, your family may disown you. If you're a 21st century American and your son or daughter is living in a homosexual relationship and you no longer express approval of that, you obviously, become uncomfortable with that, you have a different attitude toward that due to your conversion, then that family member may disown you. But this is a theme of Jesus's in other just different sayings. For example, when the man comes and says, I want to follow you, first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their dead. You must come and follow me. Or when Jesus' own family thinks he's crazy and they come to try to stage an intervention and somebody says, hey, your mother and your brothers are outside wanting to talk to you. And Jesus looks around and says to about his disciples, these are my mother and brothers. So Jesus, it's not that he's saying you should be mean to your family, but he's very definite that he knows. Okay, he says, I'm not come to bring peace but a sword, and to set the family members against one another. It sounds strange, but he knows, and he says it in teaching after teaching, that there may be some painful things that happen between the committed believer and his family members, not because he's being a jerk, Jesus isn't telling you to be a jerk, but because he's staunchly following Jesus and not compromising that, and that may cause these rifts. So for him to teach, on the one occasion in the commissioning discourse, you cannot be my disciple if you love your family members more than you love me, and that Jesus taught in a different context in Luke to the large crowds, if you come to me and you do not hate your own family members, more strongly worded, you cannot be my disciple. Very plausible that he wanted to teach this more than once, and even in words that were that similar. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. I hope this series has been helpful to those of you who have heard or will hear, composite discourses in Matthew, so they changed the times when things happened, and that was just fine, and they had no problem with doing that. Hold on a minute. It ain't necessarily so. I want to mention one other category, as I promised at the outset, but I'm not going to go into an illustration on this. I discuss it in that appendix of the Mirror or the Mask. This is a category where we don't know which of these others is the best explanation. Is it that, it's only meant to be achronological somewhere else, or did Jesus teach it twice in similar wording? Or, do we have evidence within a given gospel of Jesus teaching that very same thing twice? There is a kind of I don't want to say eschatological, but kind of a future-looking section of the commissioning discourse about dragging you before the magistrates that occurs in, I believe it's Mark, in the Olivet discourse. Okay, so those are different discourses. Matthew also has an Olivet discourse, looking to the future and having applications in the future of the church. In the future, I would say, of the disciples themselves, but also in a way that would apply to ourselves as well, future persecution. And I do not have a strong opinion of which of these types of solutions, did Jesus teach it twice or not. I discuss that in more detail in that appendix. So if you're interested, I hope you get the book and read that. Next time, I'm going to be going back to a theme of development theories about the Gospels. I had a series I did called Development Theories About the Gospels Are All Bunk, something like that. And this will be added to that I'm doing next time. This time, the supposed development is that Jesus clashes more with the Pharisees, or engages more with the Pharisees, or that the Gospels are more and more negative about the Pharisees as we go forward in time from Mark to John, and it just is not true. So I'll probably have several videos on that topic, returning to that claim. No, these development theories, they just don't stand up when you look into them. So I hope you'll come back for that next time. Please like, please subscribe if you haven't already to the Lydia McGrew channel. And as I mentioned on Facebook, not only on Spotify, but now also on Apple Podcasts, we have 2 labeled Lydia McGrew podcasts. The second of these is material from November of 2024 to the present. We ran into a glitch where, for whatever reason, my technological helper was having trouble adding more material after November of 2024. So there are 2 Lydia McGrew podcasts in each of these, and those will be linked from lydiamcgrew.com if you need to find the second one, if you want to get this material on podcast, either on Apple or on Spotify. So check that out if you like to hear audio only. Thanks for watching the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.